Howard Hughes died on April 5, 1976, aboard a Learjet flying from Acapulco to Houston. When FBI agents identified his body using fingerprints, they found an emaciated figure weighing 90 pounds, with matted hair down to his shoulders, a scraggly beard, and fingernails grown 16 inches long that curled like yellow corkscrews. He had needle marks in his arms from years of injecting codeine. His personal fortune was estimated between $1.5 and $2 billion, making him one of the wealthiest men in America. But what few people know is that this wasn't just the death of a reclusive billionaire. It was the final chapter of a descent into madness so complete, so methodical, that it turned one of the 20th century's greatest entrepreneurs into something barely human. Born on December 24, 1905, in Humble, Texas, Howard Robard Hughes Jr. was the only child of Howard Hughes Sr. and Eileen Gano Hughes, Sr. and Eileen Gano Hughes. His father had made a fortune inventing a revolutionary drill bit used in oil extraction, founding Hughes Tool Company, which held patents on equipment essential to the petroleum industry. The family was wealthy, but not aristocratic. They lived comfortably in Houston, a city booming with oil money and industrial ambition. Young Howard grew up surrounded by machinery, engineers, and the smell of oil and grease. From early childhood, Howard showed extraordinary mechanical aptitude and obsessive focus. At age 11, he built Houston's first radio transmitter from scraps of wire and metal. At 14, he took his first airplane ride at a local airfield, an experience that would shape the rest of his life. But Howard's childhood was also marked by deep anxiety. His mother was a hypochondriac who obsessively feared disease, constantly warning him about germs and illness. She checked his stool daily for signs of problems and forbade him from playing with other children during polio outbreaks. These early lessons about contamination and danger planted seeds that would grow into something much darker. In 1922, when Howard was 16, his mother died suddenly during a routine surgery. 2 years later, in 1924, his father died unexpectedly of a heart attack at age 54. At just 18 years old, Howard Hughes inherited the entirety of Hughes Tool Company, worth approximately $750,000 at the time, equivalent to roughly $11 million today. Most teenagers would have been overwhelmed. Howard took control with ruthless confidence. He fought legal battles with relatives who tried to claim shares of the estate, eventually buying them out. By 19, he had full control of one of the most profitable companies in Texas. But oil drills didn't interest him. Howard had become obsessed with two things: airplanes and movies. In 1925, he married Ella Rice, a Houston socialite, then immediately moved to Los Angeles over her objections. He wanted to break into Hollywood, and nothing would stop him. Using his inheritance as leverage, he began producing films at a time when the industry was still young and chaotic. His first films were modest successes, but Howard wasn't interested in modest. He wanted to create the biggest, most expensive, most spectacular productions ever made. In 1930, Howard Hughes produced Hell's Angels, a World War I aviation epic that became one of the most expensive films ever made at that point, costing over $3.8 million. He wasn't just a passive investor. He directed aerial combat scenes himself, hiring dozens of stunt pilots and purchasing surplus military aircraft. During filming, 3 pilots died in crashes. Hughes himself nearly died when his plane crashed during a test flight, leaving him with a crushed cheekbone and permanent injuries. But the film was a massive success, earning over $8 million at the box office. Critics praised its technical brilliance. Hughes had proven he could succeed in Hollywood through sheer force of will and relentless spending. Throughout the 1930s, Hughes produced a string of successful films, including Scarface in 1932 and The Outlaw in 1943, starring Jane Russell in a role that scandalized censors with its sexual content. But even as his film career flourished, Hughes was increasingly drawn back to aviation. He wasn't content to simply own planes. He wanted to design them, test them, and break records with them. In 1932, he founded Hughes Aircraft Company with the explicit goal of building the fastest planes in the world. By 1935, Hughes set his first world speed record, flying a plane he designed himself at 352 miles per hour. In 1937, he broke the transcontinental flight record, crossing the United States in 7 hours and 28 minutes. In 1938, he flew around the world in 91 hours, breaking the previous record by 4 days power. These weren't publicity stunts. They were feats of engineering, endurance, and obsessive preparation. Hughes personally oversaw every detail of his aircraft, spending months testing engines, fuel systems, and aerodynamics. His pilots and engineers described him as brilliant but impossible to work with, a perfectionist who demanded the impossible and fired anyone who disagreed. But behind the success, cracks were already showing for those who cared to look. Hughes had begun exhibiting strange compulsion. He insisted that people who work for him follow elaborate rules about cleanliness and hygiene. He would spend hours washing his hands, scrubbing each finger methodically. He refused to touch doorknobs directly, using tissues as barriers. When he ate in restaurants, he would inspect his food obsessively, sometimes sending back multiple plates if he suspected contamination. Friends and associates dismissed these behaviors as eccentricities of genius. They didn't realize they were witnessing the early stages of obsessive-compulsive disorder spiraling out of control. In July 1946, Hughes was piloting the XF-11, an experimental reconnaissance plane he had designed for the U.S. military, on a test flight over Los Angeles. The plane malfunctioned at 5,000 feet. One of the propellers reverse pitch, sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable dive. Hughes fought the controls for several minutes, trying desperately to steer the plane away from residential neighborhoods. He crashed into a Beverly Hills house at over 100 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Hughes was pulled from the wreckage with a crushed chest, collapsed lung, fractured skull, third-degree burns, and multiple broken bones. Doctors didn't expect him to survive. He did survive, but the crash changed him forever. During his recovery, doctors prescribed morphine for the excruciating pain. Hughes, already predisposed to obsession and compulsion, became addicted almost immediately. For the rest of his life, he would battle dependency on codeine and other opioids, self-medicating to manage both physical pain and escalating mental illness. Friends noticed that after the crash, Hughes became increasingly paranoid, withdrawn, and erratic. The man who had once loved flying, parties, and Hollywood glamour began retreating into isolation. Despite his deteriorating mental state, Hughes continued building his business empire. In 1948, he gained control of RKO Pictures, one of Hollywood's major studios. From 1948 to 1955, Hughes Aircraft Company became one of the most advanced aerospace and defense contractors in America, developing radar systems, missiles, and electronic warfare technology. He invested heavily in Trans World Airlines, eventually gaining majority control and transforming it into one of the world's leading international carriers. By the early 1950s, Hughes's business interests spanned Hollywood, aviation, defense contracting, and airlines. His fortune had grown into the hundreds of millions. But as his wealth grew, so did his paranoia. Hughes became convinced that people were trying to poison him, steal from him, or control him. He fired employees without explanation, then hired them back weeks later. He began living in the screening rooms of his studios, watching films obsessively for days at a time, barely eating or sleeping. He would sit naked in his chair, surrounded by stacks of files and boxes, issuing orders on yellow legal pads that were delivered by assistants who were forbidden to speak to him directly. He started wearing tissue boxes on his feet instead of shoes, believing they protected him from germs on the floor. In 1957, Hughes became embroiled in a scandal when his business dealings with the U.S. government came under scrutiny. He was accused of mismanaging defense contracts and wasting taxpayer money. Rather than face congressional hearings, Hughes retreated completely. He sold RKO Pictures, liquidated many of his public holdings, and withdrew from public life entirely. For the next 2 decades, almost no one outside his small circle of aides would see Howard Hughes in person again. By the 1960s, Hughes had become a ghost. He moved from hotel to hotel, living in penthouse suites with blackout curtains and sealed windows. He refused to allow sunlight into his rooms. He ate almost nothing, subsisting on chicken, chocolate, and milk. His weight dropped to under 100 pounds. His hair and nails grew unchecked. He watched the same movies over and over, sometimes replaying a single film 50 times in a row. He sat naked in his chair for months, urinating into jars that were never emptied, lined up in rows around his room. His staff, known as the Mormon Mafia, because Hughes preferred to hire clean-cut Latter-day Saints who didn't drink or smoke, followed elaborate protocols to care for him. They were required to use multiple layers of tissue to hand him anything. They could not speak unless spoken to. They transcribed his orders, which became increasingly bizarre. Once, Hughes spent an entire week writing a detailed memo about the proper way to open a can of peaches. Another time, he refused to eat for 10 days because a fly had landed on his food tray. Despite his isolation, Hughes continued making major business decisions. In 1966, he moved to Las Vegas and began buying up casinos and hotels, including the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Castaways, and the Frontier. He purchased local television stations so he could control what programs aired late at night when he was awake. He bought mining claims and vast tracts of Nevada land. At one point, Hughes owned so much property in Las Vegas that he was considered the city's largest private landowner and employer. But he never visited any of these properties in person. He issued all instructions from his sealed penthouse suite atop the Desert Inn, communicating only through written memos. By 1970, Hughes's paranoia had reached delusional levels. He became convinced that the FBI, the CIA, and rival business interests were conspiring to take over his companies. He moved from Las Vegas to the Bahamas, then to Nicaragua, then to Mexico, always staying in luxury hotels, but living in conditions of squalor. His personal hygiene had collapsed completely. He refused to bathe or cut his hair and nails. His teeth rotted and fell out. He wore no clothes and sat in his own waste for days at a time. His business empire, now valued at over $1 billion, was essentially run by a small group of executives and lawyers who had power of attorney to make decisions in his name. But without Hughes's direct oversight, the companies began to stagnate. Airlines lost market share. Defense contracts dried up, real estate investments sat undeveloped. The empire that Hughes had built through obsessive attention to detail was decaying because that same obsession had turned inward, consuming him. In April 1976, Hughes was living in Acapulco, Mexico, in a penthouse suite at the Princess Hotel. His health had deteriorated catastrophically. He weighed less than 90 pounds. He was suffering from kidney failure, malnutrition, dehydration, and chronic infections. On April 5th, his aides finally convinced him to fly to Houston for medical treatment. During the flight, Howard Hughes died. He was 70 years old. When his body arrived in Houston, authorities struggled to identify him. The emaciated figure with long matted hair, a scraggly beard, and grotesque fingernails bore no resemblance to photos of the dashing young aviator and film producer. FBI agents used fingerprints taken decades earlier to confirm it was really him. The autopsy revealed needle marks up and down his arms from years of injecting codeine. His organs showed signs of severe neglect and malnutrition. The coroner determined that Hughes had essentially died from the cumulative effects of untreated mental illness, addiction, and deliberate self-neglect. And then came the chaos. Howard Hughes had never written a will. Or rather, dozens of alleged wills surfaced, each one claiming to be authentic, each one leaving his fortune to different people. Some left money to distant cousins. Some left it to former employees. One infamous document, known as the Mormon Will, supposedly left a portion of his estate to Melvin Dumar, a Utah gas station owner who claimed he had once picked up Hughes hitchhiking in the desert. That will was later proven to be a forgery. For years, lawyers and courts battled over Hughes' estate. More than 1,000 people came forward claiming to be relatives or heirs. Hundreds of lawsuits were filed. The legal fees alone ran into the tens of millions. Finally, in 1981, courts ruled that Hughes had died intestate, without a valid will. His fortune, estimated at $2.5 billion, was divided among 22 maternal and paternal cousins, most of whom had never met him and knew almost nothing about him. The Hughes Aircraft Company was eventually sold to General Motors for $5 billion in 1985. Trans World Airlines was broken up and sold off. The Las Vegas properties were liquidated. The empire dissolved. What remains is a cautionary tale about wealth, genius, and the fragility of the human mind. Howard Hughes was not a failure. He was one of the most successful entrepreneurs of the 20th century. He revolutionized aviation, transformed Hollywood, built a billion-dollar conglomerate, and lived a life most people couldn't imagine. But success couldn't protect him from the demons in his own mind. The same obsessive focus that allowed him to build planes, break records, and create empires also made him vulnerable to compulsions and paranoia that consumed him entirely. This wasn't random madness. It was systematic decline driven by untreated mental illness, reinforced by unlimited wealth and power that allowed him to isolate himself completely. If Hughes had been poor, his compulsions might have been treatable. If he had been forced to interact with the world, he might have been able to maintain his sanity. But wealth gave him the ability to retreat into his own mind, to build a fortress of isolation where no one could reach him, and that fortress became his prison. Today, Howard Hughes is remembered as both a genius and a tragic figure. His innovations in aviation and aerospace engineering paved the way for modern flight technology. His films remain classics of early Hollywood. His business empire helped shape 20th-century American industry. But his legacy is inseparable from his madness, his paranoia, and his lonely death in a plane surrounded by people who worked for him but barely knew him. The billionaire who vanished into his own mind, leaving no heirs, no will, no final message, only a fortune fought over by strangers and a story that still haunts anyone who hears it.